2024, the year that must not be named, the Voldemort of years, if you will. After a generation of globalization and peace between major powers and economic integration and stability, we find ourselves in 2024 in a new political, social, and economic world. Business leaders are finding themselves thinking about geopolitics more now than at any point in recent history. Welcome to a new episode of The Brief. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host Scott Crockett and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate those stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. And on today's episode, we are taking things global. We are joined by geopolitical experts from the Eurasia Group, Willis Sparks, the Director of Global Macro, and Anna Ashton, the Director of China Corporate Affairs and U.S.-China, to talk about some of the top political risks facing us this year. We've packed a lot into this episode, covering the gamut of things: Russia, Ukraine, Israel-Hamas, the U.S. election, China, Canada and the U.S., energy markets, food, and so much more. So make your favorite drink, grab a snack, and settle in to the top risks of 2024. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show.
So today we're fortunate to be joined by two incredible, intelligent gurus from the Eurasia Group who are joining our business council later today to talk live with our membership about global geopolitical trends, something CEOs for a long time preferred not to think too much about, but these days probably one of the biggest topics that we're hearing all the time. And you folks have just put out a report, your top risks for 2024, which you call the Voldemort of years, the Annus Horribilis, the year that must not be named. And we'll jump into that in just a moment. But I thought I would just invite you each to just give us a couple sentences introducing yourself. Anna, maybe we can start with you. What drew you to a career in U.S.-China relations?
Sure. So I actually, Scott, started out majoring in comparative literature, but quickly discovered that you don't end up knowing anything that is transferable in terms of skills if you major in comparative literature, because somebody has to explain all of the literature.
Right.
So I picked a region and thought, I'll learn the culture, the history, the politics, and the literature as part of that. And my dad was living in Hong Kong and dissuaded me from majoring in Japanese because he thought that Chinese would be more useful. And here I am.
Well, that's a great story. And okay, Willis, tell us what brought you into this world, and start with when you were once a stuntman.
Well, before I was a stuntman, actually, at the Metropolitan Opera, a couple of years before I was a stuntman, I was at the Juilliard School as a student. And we had an exchange with the Moscow Art Theater School in April of 1989. And so my first trip to Moscow was the height of perestroika. It was Soviet Moscow, and we spent 3 weeks there, and I got derailed by that. I learned so much about, I learned more about America to start with. Just, you realize all of the assumptions that we make about what is universal and what is particular, and you discover that there's very little that's actually universal. But, landing in the Soviet Union right as things were coming apart, and then getting involved in that. And then, of course, China, Tiananmen Square happened about 6 weeks after I left there. And so I got completely fascinated by it, ended up going to the Berlin Wall to knock down a piece of it myself. And I didn't actually start into this line of work for another 10 years, but I've been at Eurasia Group for almost 20 years now, working for Ian Bremmer.
Fantastic.
And yes, I did work at the Metropolitan Opera as a stuntman in La Fanciulla del West with Placido Domingo, Girl of the Golden West, and it was hilarious and a great experience.
Wonderful. A great piece of backstory. Let's jump into your report, which I think is characterized at its top level by three conflicts that you talk about in the world. And let's start with one of those. I'm going to jump right into the Russia-Ukraine war, and I'm a fan of the cold open, so I'm going to tell you the thing I thought in the report that jumped out to me and was the most interesting was it said, President Biden, one of Ukraine's staunchest supporters, doesn't like or trust Volodymyr Zelensky. What's the deal with that?
I don't know that, it may be a stretch to say he doesn't like him personally, but I think he understands that their interests are not the same. They are clearly allies. They have been forced into becoming allies. But obviously, Volodymyr Zelensky's goal is to save Ukraine and to lead Ukraine toward what he hopes will be a European future in the European Union, perhaps in NATO, if that's what it takes to be delivered from threats from Russia over the longer term. President Biden has an incentive clearly to help him do that is both security policy and political, and yet his main objective, President Biden's main objective, is to contain the war in Ukraine. And so he has gone sort of into the water one toe at a time here because he wants to make sure that he doesn't inadvertently provoke a wider war that no one wants. So that has led to some frustration from Mr. Zelensky, who has voiced that frustration at times, much to the impatience of the Biden administration. So I don't think that they have a bad relationship, but I think we have to remember that they've got a completely different set of interests. They're the presidents of two very different countries. And while they do have a sort of common ideal future in mind, how you get there and what you're willing to spend to get there, the two men see things differently.
Where do you think we're headed with this particular conflict in 2024?
Nowhere. In 2024, we are at a dead end. And we are at a dead end because both sides still believe that they can win the war. And you are not going to have a negotiation until both sides are willing to give up real things, willing to compromise. And neither side at this point, you can talk about talks all you want to and the future bargaining and maybe an eventual partition of Ukraine. Maybe you have to trade some land for some future security guarantee. But that's not a 2024 story because Putin thinks that time is on his side. He sees divisions in America, in Europe, within NATO broadly, over just how much commitment should be made to Ukraine in the near term. He's hoping that Donald Trump is going to be elected president in November, which could change NATO's attitude toward its own future. We can talk about that a little bit later. So we're stuck. We have a stalemate. It's not a stable stalemate because the fact that they're dug into World War I style trenches and the front line isn't moving encourages them to use drones and missiles to shoot long distance at one another in ways that are dangerous, could be destabilizing if somebody makes a mistake. So it's not a stable stalemate. It's not just ground to nothing. But the war's not going to end until there's a bargain, and nobody's interested in bargaining right now.
So the report makes a prediction that is probably unpopular on every side of that war, which is that we might be headed towards partition. Is that your view?
Unless there is some game changer that we're not going to see in 2024, then there's going to have to be some land for peace kind of deal. Again, the issue is of the vast majority of the Ukrainian people are not ready to trade 1 inch of what they consider to be Ukraine to Russia. And Putin is all in. Putin is now, he's staked his entire legacy on the success of this war. So, it would be very easy for us outsiders to say, come to some accommodation on Crimea that gives the future Ukrainian state reliable access to the Black Sea without fear of a future Russian attack. Maybe the Russians stay in some of the eastern provinces, Donbass provinces that they already occupy. They're sitting on about 18% of Ukrainian land. They may get a little more, a little less over the long term, and then let Ukraine go, and maybe Ukraine can become a member of the European Union in the future. But it's so easy for us outsiders to say, and it's so hard for them to get there. Nobody's ready to go there yet.
Speaking of hard to get there, let's pivot to the second major conflict that's in all the headlines, which as we sit here in spring of 2024, we've had some conflicting reports in recent weeks on how close the Israel-Hamas war might be to a conclusion. What's your view?
Well, one of the interesting problems of bringing this war to a conclusion is that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to remain the Israeli prime minister for as long as he can. And at the moment that this war ends, then the first question facing Israel will be, how fast do we get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu? Because he was already a polarizing figure. Before the war, he was a polarizing figure. Now he's also responsible for the worst security failure in the history of Israel. No lie. So, he's sort of, there's a clock ticking, but the longer that he can continue to prolong the war, his interest is to keep this going longer, and maybe if he can accomplish more than he originally hoped for, maybe he can reverse his political fortunes. So that complicates the issue, because it means that Israel is really kind of impervious to outside pressure. And while a lot of Israeli people don't care for Benjamin Netanyahu at all, they are very determined after what happened on October 7th and the Hamas killing of 1,200 Israelis. This can never happen again. And so while Netanyahu may not be popular, the idea of trying to remove Hamas as a force in the world is enormously popular in Israel. So the Israelis are ignoring a lot of international pressure, including from the Americans and others. Again, this is another sort of break on how do we get to a negotiated settlement. And, there's no infinite amount of time here, but the Israelis have good reasons to take their time and try to accomplish as much as they can.
Do you think that goal of eradication of Hamas, is that realistic? Is it possible? The leadership's hanging out in Qatar.
Yeah, it's not so much about the leadership, because I think it's just, the sheer number of fighters and the sheer number of weapons. And I've heard a lot of very smart people disagree on this question of, when you talk about crippling Hamas, what do you mean, and is that possible? And the honest answer is, I don't think we know what's possible yet. We certainly know that there are a lot of Palestinian civilians who are trapped in the crossfire, and it's not clear what their future is. But the idea that you're going to completely eradicate Hamas, I think it's an iffy proposition. But Hamas is not Israel's only enemy, of course. And there are, Hezbollah is not going anywhere, from Lebanon. And there are other, Iranian-backed proxy groups that are very sympathetic. Right. So it is not just about Hamas, but it's not going well in terms of the total eradication that Prime Minister Netanyahu originally promised.
Well, before we get to the third major conflict that your report talks about, which I think is a kind of a surprising one, at least it was to me when I first read it, I actually want to go to what I think is the other biggest story in the world right now, which is China. And Anna, I'd like to bring you here in. So we're seeing a number of factors and indicators in China that show that it's on a downward trajectory. And there are some other factors that I think are standing in the way potentially of any kind of recovery. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Scott, of course, the economic miracle of China in the last few decades is something that most people haven't missed. But it was never expected, even by Chinese leadership, to be sustainable forever. There was an expectation that there would come a point where China had to deal with the challenge of overcoming the middle income trap, and you could argue that that's essentially where they are. They have some pretty significant systemic challenges there. One of them is that the major driver of economic growth in the country was far more significant than it should have been, and that's the real estate sector. Measures were actively taken to try to sort of pop that bubble or deflate that bubble. And those measures were more effective maybe than everyone would have wished. Real estate's not coming back as a major driver. There's not a lot of other places for people to park their money and try to accumulate savings. So it's contributing to domestic reticence to go out and spend, so low consumer demand. In addition to that, the leadership is sort of searching around for what the next big growth engine is going to be. Seems to be settling on these new industries, green energy, new energy vehicles, but challenges arising from that include overproduction and oversupply, and then potential dumping onto foreign markets, which creates more tension with trading partners with whom the tension is already pretty intense.
So one of the stories that I follow closely, and I think a lot of people do, is China's demographics. Talk to us a little bit about that. Just how terminal are China's demographics? How serious is the situation?
Well, there are officially fewer young people than old people at this point. And of course, the one-child policy that lasted until just a few years ago started in the 70s, around the time that I was born. That created a situation where ultimately the generation that I'm in and younger generations would be taking care of more elderly people than probably children in their households. As labor costs have increased and pressure on the workforce has increased, this demographic shift is more pronounced, more exacerbated. And it's a problem that they can't get around. It is terminal. The question is just, can they automate out of it? Are there other solutions, building up the healthcare infrastructure, creating more of a social safety net that will help to take care of the elderly population and allow the working age population to go to work and provide for their families with a little less pressure.
Characterize the relationship today between the United States and China, and maybe in particular between Biden and Xi.
Sure. So you asked a question ahead of this as to whether Biden and Xi were the adults.
Grown-ups. Are they the grown-ups in the room? Yeah.
Right. Are they the grown-ups in the room? And I would say, they're both trying to be the grown-ups and to manage the global economy responsibly, because these are the two most significant economic powers in the world. But it's hard because this is not a friendly custody dispute. This is an ugly custody dispute. I think that they've made dramatic progress in the last year and change, building new channels for communication and dialogue, which is certainly a refreshing development compared to the years from about 2018, when the Trump administration ended the strategic dialogue that had long existed between the U.S. and China, and 2023, which really was characterized by an overwhelming lack of communication. So the communication channels are good, the talks are ongoing, and that commitment by both sides is what I'm referring to when I talk about them trying to be the adults in the room. But the reality is that the strategic differences remain, they're entrenched, they're significant, and they're not going anywhere.
Can I just say one thing about this subject generally, is this is the biggest story in the world. This meaning what is happening to China's trajectory, and what is the relationship between China and the United States, and for that matter, the European Union. This is, for your listeners, whether they're interested in the future of the global economy, whether energy or whatever people are interested in. As important as these two wars are, this story of China, what's happening in China, how the Chinese leadership responds to what's happening in China, how the American leadership engages or fails to engage with China, is a far more important story for the global economy than anything that is going to happen in either of the two wars on the edge of Europe or in the Middle East, because China and the U.S. are at the center of the international system, whereas Russia has frankly opted out of the international system. Russia has become the world's biggest rogue state. And whatever happens in the Middle East, maybe there's some grand bargain eventually in the future. This story, this China story, is the one that I think by far has the greatest weight in terms of what kind of world we're going to be living in 5 or 10 years from now.
Whenever I talk to friends in China, folks from China, officials from China, one line always sort of sticks with me. They'll always say some version of, not everyone sees things exactly the same way that you do. And you have to understand that sitting in North America. And I think, Anna, you were sort of referring to that the Chinese calculation in many of these geopolitical issues is just fundamentally different. But the question, I guess, would be, can China and the U.S. figure out a way to work together productively in the next 5 or 10 years? What do you think that relationship is going to look like? Is it going to get better, or are we headed towards more tension?
Are there common interests that could cause China and the U.S. to try to work together productively? Yes, there absolutely are. The stability of the global economy being one of them, climate change being one of them, and global pandemics and trying to prevent global health crises being another. But will they manage to work together successfully? I think that is an open question, that it is heavily dependent on things like the outcome of the U.S. presidential election and the platform that, if there's a second Trump administration, that that Trump administration decides on when it comes to managing the relationship with China. It depends on how entrenched Xi Jinping's focus on national security continues to become. It depends on whether or not the two sides can continue talking. And those are a lot of factors that are unsettled.
So you mentioned the U.S. election, which is where we're going next. But one more question before we get there. Taiwan. What's the relationship like in Taiwan right now? What's the future of that strait in particular, and maybe in particular also the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity? Is that going to continue? Does that have a future?
So the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity, I feel, has already been undermined by the president himself because he's been less than ambiguous about about the U.S.
It's a nice way of saying it.
The U.S. being willing to come to Taiwan's defense if China provokes some sort of conflict. But the one China policy that has long been the United States' position is something that the Biden administration has emphatically reaffirmed multiple times. Would a subsequent administration, whether Democrat or Republican, continue to emphatically reaffirm the one China policy? Not 100% clear.
Right.
And that is one of those red lines that could prompt China to feel that it must take military action sooner rather than later. Does China want to take military action? No. China would like to become reunited with Taiwan without there being a military conflict. China would like Taiwan to be persuaded that it wants to rejoin the mainland, whether that persuasion is strong-arming or more or a softer method. Persuasion is preferable to killing.
I would say in most cases that would be the case. Yeah.
Well, one quick point on Taiwan is the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, has not been in combat since 1979.
That is important.
And that matters. And the Chinese leadership knows, the political leadership knows that, the military leadership knows that. So they have invested enormous amounts of money in building up their military capacity. But the truth is, they knew even before 2 years ago that you start a war, you don't know where that goes.
Right.
And Taiwan has spent a lot of money becoming a porcupine, which is,
right.
Yeah, you
To
can
harden
probably
itself.
eat me, but I'm not going down smooth. The Chinese already knew this before 2 years ago. Then the Russians invaded Ukraine and gave everyone in the world an ample demonstration of just how badly things can go when you think you know what you're doing.
Right.
The Russians thought they were going to take Kiev in 4 days.
I
That
remember
that was 2 years ago.
Right. I remember in the days immediately following the war, the U.S. was offering Zelensky a ride out because they assumed that
That's right.
the war would be over in minutes.
I thought he would take it.
Right.
No, but again, the point here is, let's not underestimate the fact that, just to underline Anna's point, the Chinese don't want a war with Taiwan because they know that while they would probably win a war with Taiwan because they care far more about Taiwan than the United States does, the cost is unknowable. It's not only unknown, it's unknowable until the die is cast.
Right.
And so they have every reason to continue to apply pressure. But let's not overestimate the extent to which the Chinese would be deeply reluctant to start a war that they don't know exactly how it would go. And by the way, the United States knows that too, and it's one of the reasons why they continue to arm Taiwan, just to increase the size of that question mark.
Right. And I also liked how you said that the future of strategic ambiguity may already have been undermined. I always thought that that's been one of the sort of the most interesting geopolitical or strategic policies because it reminds me of grade school. Actually, it's are you going to step? It's like the playground. Are you going to step in here? Well, maybe I will. Maybe I won't.
Yeah.
If you mess around, you'll find out.
Right.
And it I've got a son who's in grade school.
Mess around and find out.
Mess around and find out. Yeah, there's maybe a different word in front of that sometimes, depending.
Yes.
Okay, let's go to the third major conflict. And in your report, the risk report, you call this the United States versus itself.
Yes.
That's a pretty provocative thing to say, especially to line it up after the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war. So I'll ask it bluntly. How close is the U.S. to fighting itself? How close is the U.S. to internal conflict?
Well, if you mean a shooting war, I don't think we're very close. I come from the South, and Anna also comes from the South, and so we hear, South's going to rise again periodically. I don't think that, we don't want to overstate this.
Sure.
Also, the battle lines between red and blue would not be that easy to draw. But when we say that there is a war between the United States and itself, what we mean is, as my boss Ian Bremmer likes to say, the U.S. has the most dysfunctional political system of any rich country in the world. Mm-hmm. And that sounds like a huge statement. Well, stop and think about it. What percentage of Americans will tell pollsters that they think that Joe Biden stole the last election? There are jaw-dropping things that people tell pollsters in America. And the reason is because, like everywhere else, people on one side of the political spectrum get their news and their information about the world from completely different sources than the people on the other side. And I think maybe it's worse in America because our system encourages people,
I think that part is demonstrably worse, right?
The United States economy is very good at feeding demand. And there is demand, as there is everywhere, but on an industrial scale in America, tell me that my side is right and the other side is wrong. And there's a kind of Manichaean, like the other side is really a threat to the future of the republic, and our side's got to win. And so now we've got this election where, this is a point I'm going to make later today when we're on stage, is that, there are people who will tell pollsters, is Biden too old for a second term? Absolutely. There's no question he's too old. Who are you going to vote for? Well, Biden. Really? Why? Well, you can't have Trump. On the Trump side, Republican voter, do you think that Donald Trump is a good role model for your children? Well, no. Okay, who are you going to vote for? Well, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. You can't have Democrats in power for another 4 years. They'll destroy the country. And so there's this just non-comprehension. And we have seen not only the potential for violence, we have seen some violence. I mean, what happened at the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021, and there is even a debate about what happened there, which is incredible given the sheer number of cameras that
video
recorded
footage.
it. So there's a tremendous sense of dread in America right now, deep dread on both sides, that we have an election that nobody wants and no one can figure out a way out of. And the two men are deeply different in terms of where they come from. Donald Trump is a very transactional person and politician, which in some ways makes him successful in areas where a more ideologically driven person would be less successful.
Sure.
But there's also,
unpredictability.
There is something, to be said for the predictability of the government of the world's leading superpower, and Americans are stuck with an election they don't want.
It's I think it's a very accurate but somewhat scary picture that you're painting, because when you're describing the example polls that you talked about and how people view each of the candidates, that sounds like a very sort of calcified public where you'd be almost impervious to new information. If you've decided that I'm voting for this guy, even though there's lots about him that I don't like, but I'm willing to overlook it because I think the other folks are just so terrible, almost no new information can come at you that's going to change your mind.
Not only that, I do think that's calcified, but not only that, in our system, in the Electoral College system, there are probably at a maximum of 6 states out of the 50 that are going to make any difference in the outcome of the election. If you showed me a map of the United States and here are the 50 states, I can tell you how 44 of them are going to vote right now. And the margins in the other 6 are very, very small. And this is why I think that polling in America, public opinion polling, is a huge industry. There's so much money being spent now. And you get all these creative questions. But at the end of the day, because opinions are calcified, there are really only 2 questions that really matter at all. 1, are you going to vote? 2, who are you going to vote for? I don't care who you like. I don't care what issue you think is most important. I don't care whether you think your guy's handling that issue well, or whether you think that this guy is a good person, or whether you like him. Don't know. Are you going to vote? Who are you going to vote for? And unless you're talking about Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, maybe Michigan and Wisconsin, I don't know. I live in New York City. This is,
the outcome is predetermined.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a strange overlay between this reality, this domestic American political reality, and the rare bipartisan agreement on the topic of China in Washington, which is that there's an underlying disillusionment among the American working class, which is why there's just this small number of states that are really deciding the outcome of the presidential election. Those are the Rust Belt states. Those are the labor union states, and who those people choose to vote for will likely determine who the next president is. Most of them feel that China took their jobs and that the U.S. government did a terrible job of replacing those jobs with new industries that were viable and that allowed them to make the same living or better living and stay in their hometowns or their communities. And that is a problem that both parties are trying to wrestle with and come up with new solutions for, which is why we're seeing so much protectionism offered by both Republicans and Democrats. It's why we're seeing a turn away from the global trade architecture. And that makes it more difficult to get to the table with China and figure out how to negotiate terms for the relationship that are compatible.
It's a great point. Protectionism is having a long moment right now in the U.S. and
Canadians notice that too, actually.
Of course. But that's a really important point, is that Democrats and Republicans disagree on 99.3% of things, but not on China.
Not on China.
On China, the question is, who's going to do a better job of protecting you from the predations of China and the way that it approaches these economic questions?
Right. Help us put an idea to bed that I hear a lot in the coffee shops in Calgary and Edmonton and elsewhere in Canada. You brought up the age of the two presidential candidates. They're old men. And Canadians can't help looking at this saying, there's 330 million people in this country. How are these the best two that the country has managed to put forward? The idea that I've asked you to either validate or put to bed is, what's the likelihood at this stage that we'd see alternative candidates for either of those parties?
Quite low. If there were, first of all, Democrats are aware that when a president who is eligible to run for re-election opts not to run for re-election, that party almost always loses the White House. That's an old story that goes back 100 years. I mean, you can look at Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run for re-election in 1968. Is one example. Or when there is a challenge from within the party. So Senator Edward Kennedy gave Jimmy Carter quite a run for his money in 1980, and it arguably created a fatal weakness for Jimmy Carter. And so people are uncomfortable with Biden. They're very nervous about his age. But unless he's willing to get out of the way, he also, let's be honest, he benefits from the fact that his vice president is less popular than he is. That's the truth, is that if people were more excited about Kamala Harris as a politician,
there was an heir apparent.
If there were a clear heir apparent instead of what looked like might turn into a food fight, maybe it would be different. Donald Trump, sucks all of the oxygen out of every room, just the size of his force of personality. And Nikki Haley is doing her best, and a lot of people have come out punching. And the only way that the fever around Donald Trump breaks in the Republican Party is if he loses again. If he loses, then Republicans are going to decide, okay, we may start imitating him a lot more, but he's officially done. But that hasn't happened, and he's got a real chance to win in November, so we have to keep watching.
Are there any edge case scenarios, just while you're speculating, that could result in different candidates?
Well, obviously they're terrible scenarios if somebody
if
somebody had a health crisis.
Sure. Yeah. Other than
I think that the people who are hoping on the Democratic side that Donald Trump is going to be convicted of a felony before the election, that's looking less and less likely. You probably saw the story yesterday that the Supreme Court has agreed to consider the question of whether Donald Trump has immunity from some of the...
And that alone just creates some time.
And so that just extends the timeline before you even get to the start of a trial. And so Donald Trump's legal situation will be very much front and center in the media in the summer and the fall, but the idea that he's going to be convicted of something before the first Tuesday in November is very unlikely. So there's a possibility, but I don't know what it would take other than maybe a health crisis. And we've had that conversation before.
Right. So let's try and make the American election most relevant from a Canadian perspective. Canada and the U.S. have this incredible special relationship. The biggest trading relationship on Earth. I think the greatest integration culturally, politically, socially, strategically, perhaps of any two countries almost ever in the history of the world.
Right.
What should Canadians be looking at in this election? What do you think the implications look like for Canada based on either outcome?
Well, let's start with NATO. I mean, just to go global. I do think the threat that Donald Trump is going to withdraw the United States from NATO is very overrated. I think there is a misunderstanding about Donald Trump's intentions. Now, this is a double-edged sword, and I'll explain that. But I think that what Donald Trump's view is that the Europeans need to get serious enough about their own security to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, as they've pledged to do for decades. They have said they're going to do that.
Yes.
And Donald Trump is making the point, well, these European countries, they're not spending the money. If they don't take their own security seriously enough to spend the money on it, then I'm going to play hardball with them, and I'm going to force them into spending more money. And he had some success with that in his first term. That's not an unreasonable position to take. However,
Canada as well has not spent the 2% of GDP target.
And there you go. And so Donald Trump, being the transactional, hard-driving guy that he is making a very reasonable point. Unfortunately, he's making it in a way that is encouraging Vladimir Putin to test NATO in ways that are increasingly dangerous. And it's also possible that maybe Putin is overreading what Donald Trump's true intentions are as well. The other thing that I would say is, even if Donald Trump was serious about taking the U.S. out of NATO, it ain't that easy. There are a lot of institutional forces in Washington that would slam the brakes on that and do everything they could. And that's not a widely held opinion beyond Donald Trump, beyond Mar-a-Lago. There are not a lot of people, even in the Republican Party, arguably especially in the Republican Party, saying this is a good idea. So I think that that's one issue where I do think things are overrated. I do, the North American free trade picture is liable to change again in 2026. And if Donald Trump were elected, he's going to do his thing. He's going to go out and threaten everybody and threaten to blow everything up. And I think, Canada obviously is very well aware of the risk that goes there.
USMCA is up for renewal. Yep.
That's right. So, and Trump's going to play hardball. That doesn't mean he's going to blow it up, but he is going to threaten to blow it up, and everybody should be prepared for that. But in general, I agree with you that I think the longest undefended border in the world between the U.S. and Canada is still, for all the things that people disparagingly say about democracy these days, I think the U.S.-Canada relationship is still a model for how large countries ought to behave toward one another.
And the success or failure of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, rests in part on how things have unfolded with that agreement and China. Less so because of Canada, much more so because of Mexico, and the fact that a lot of Chinese manufacturing is moving to Mexico, where it can avoid the tariffs and reach the American market more easily. So it's like displaced anti-competitive behavior. And then there are de minimis shipments, which are packages that are shipped to individual consumers that are valued at less than $800. They're skyrocketing from companies like Shein and Temu because of the fact that they are exempt from customs inspection. And so and a lot of them are being warehoused. The goods are being warehoused in Mexico and then shipped in de minimis packaging across the border. So those sorts of things are going to have to be addressed before the U.S. can agree to stick to USMCA.
You talked about a minute ago about the world's longest undefended border, which I think is it's sort of something that is indicative. It shows what the relationship is like. Last year, I went camping right on that border. There's an international park.
Please don't tell me anybody shot at you.
No one shot. No, the exact opposite. Waterton International Park. It in southern Alberta, it bridges Canada and the United States. There's a little campsite right on the border. There's a marker about the border, and there's even a sign shortly past that says more or less, U.S., the tone of the sign is, feel free to hike into the United States for a little bit, and if you're going to go more than a couple miles, you have to let this ranger station know. And I just laughed to myself about it because that says something about what the relationship is, right? That you can walk freely across this border, and no one's really going to bother you at all about it. That's a lead in to my sort of last question on this relationship, which is, I have this dream for Canada and the United States, which is, if you look at the two countries, the U.S. in particular and Canada have almost everything they need on their own, in every sense, economically, resources, strategically. Together, we have basically everything that you could possibly want. What do you think is the likelihood of a closer strategic and economic relationship in the next 4 years? The idea that increasingly we would treat each other as domestic, even on more and more files. Is that a pipe dream, or do you think that's possible?
Well, I would say, and I'm coming at this from the China angle, right? So obviously that's not the only consideration, even if it is the only consideration that I think about on a daily basis. But the U.S. and Canada have a lot in common when it comes to considering how to respond to potential strategic threats posed by China, whether that is figuring out what to do to stand up critical minerals mining and processing, or figuring out how to manage the melting Arctic and the northern passage for shipping that may develop from that. We've seen the U.S. and Canada cooperate closely on China-related issues, for example, in response to the balloon. But also, the United States has a tendency to take Canada for granted. And I think the Meng Wanzhou situation is a perfect example of that. What the United States wanted Meng detained for was not something that Canada would have detained Meng for. And yet Canada and Canadian citizens paid a pretty hefty price for cooperating with the United States and going along with that request. I think if Canada and the United States are going to have more effective cooperation, there has to be more than shared interests. There has to be greater mutual respect.
I would say this is not the right moment for this dream, but there are people who would like to see a broader hemispheric trade network. So top of North America to the tip of South America. Now, again, this is a protectionist moment, certainly in the United States. This is not the time for that. But if you're looking out over the course of a decade, and you're being honest about the enormous political obstacles that would be raised by the sheer diversity of different kinds of economies and different sets of economic interests that you're going to encounter in Central and South America, if there were greater hemispheric coordination, not even necessarily a USMCA that goes all the way down, but just a tighter network in the Western Hemisphere, I do think that would pull the U.S. and Canada together, because the U.S. and Canada share more in common in terms of culturally and in political culture than the states that would be part of that network. But again, this is longer term. This is not a 2024 story, but there are people who are writing about this, and the desire is there once people become more acceptant about the idea that trade can still lift people into a higher position in the middle class.
But there's been some experience that that's not always the case.
Yes, that's right.
So we like to conclude these podcasts with what we call lightning round. A few quick economic questions. So if you'll indulge me, we'll hit you on that. What's your view of oil and gas and energy markets in the next 12 months? What are we going to see?
Stability, because on the one hand, you've got the supply risk associated with the wars going on. You've got a war in the Middle East right now. You've got a war with a major energy supplier in Russia. And we saw that a gas pipeline became a target recently. It seems that that Europe is in a kind of a precarious situation. So you do have these supply issues that are going to keep prices at a high level. They're going to put a floor under prices. But what's happening in China, I think, keeps them from going even higher, because the demand on the China side is going to be a lot slower to recover than people were fantasizing about when Xi Jinping lifted the lockdown restrictions on the pandemic.
And not just because of the fact that the economy is recovering kind of sluggishly, but also because of the fact that although it may have been done in an anti-competitive way, China has finally brought enough solar power, for example, online to start to actually keep up with the growth in demand.
Critical minerals.
Critical minerals.
It's going to get worse. Well, so that people know what we're talking about. When you're talking about the green economy, the development of the green economy, the development of the digital economy, we're starting to, even people like me are having to learn more about lithium and nickel and copper and in particular these rare earth minerals whose names I will not try to pronounce. Anna could probably pronounce them. which are overwhelmingly found in China and are overwhelmingly processed and refined in China. So, we used to talk about resource nationalism, the way countries might use their oil and gas supplies to gain geopolitical advantage. Well, now we're talking about all these minerals that are a crucial part of virtually everything that you're going to make that's going to be a key component in the success in the 21st century global economy. And there are countries that are taking defensive measures. We're going to ban the export of this thing that we might need, or we're going to try and invest. We're going to subsidize. The Pentagon is actually subsidizing the development of rare earth minerals in the United States to try to create the economic incentive so that the United States doesn't find itself dangerously dependent on stuff that the Chinese might not want to provide. So you've got distorted supply chains, you've got all kind of market distortions, but you're going to be hearing more about these minerals as kind of tools of economic power, and maybe more than economic power, maybe security power as well. That's a big story this year.
Yeah, they really are quite important to so many things, to new energy products as well as to weapons and military aircraft. And I think it's pretty clear that China is looking at the U.S. approach to tech competition, which from their perspective looks pretty zero-sum. And the restrictions that the U.S. is continuing to place on Chinese access to high-end chips, for example, but not just high-end chips. And they see their near monopoly over mining and processing, especially processing of critical minerals and rare earth metals, as a potential lever for dissuading the U.S. from going too far down that road. And we've seen them come out with now 3 new export licensing restrictions on gallium and germanium, and then more significantly on graphite, which remains at the moment critically necessary to make the batteries that go into new energy vehicles. And while it's not clear that they're actually enforcing these licensing restrictions in a way that's actually preventing, U.S. and other international buyers from accessing these commodities, there is now written down in the law potential for them to, at any point, ratchet up the tension and start restricting those things.
And this loops back to your question about oil and gas, because as Anna just said, a lot of these critical minerals are crucial for the development of a green economy.
Absolutely.
And we're at a time where interest rates are high around the world and there is economic weakness. And because interest rates are high, it's more expensive to invest in new technologies. So you put together the idea that these critical minerals are going to become tools that governments use against one another or try to hoard in order to protect themselves. And then you add in the fact that there are other factors that are depressing the development of green technologies. That's another reason why we don't see any kind of collapse in the hydrocarbon energy prices, and why they're liable to remain. There's this tension. Climate change is going to make headlines again this year. There's going to be more forest fires in Canada and the U.S.
Canada had its worst wildfire season on record last year, and it's
there's
shaping up to be.
Good reason to believe it's going to be worse this year. El Nino and there are other factors. So you've got all these pressures working against one another, but in the larger sense, it's keeping a stability in hydrocarbons, because there is so much uncertainty, and because we don't know how fast this transition is going to go, no matter what people predict or pledge themselves to pursue.
Yeah, with your years that end in 5 and 0 always.
Yes.
You mentioned El Nino, food. How concerned are you about food globally this year?
Well, El Nino is going to have its biggest effect, according to meteorologists. Meteorology is a little bit outside of my purview, but I'm told that it's the southern hemisphere where it's going to have its biggest impact, which is one thing if you're talking about Australia, but if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, or you're talking about developing countries in South America or South Asia, for example, these are countries that are already have cash issues, that are already developing countries that are coming out of the pandemic, that have been dealing with all of the food insecurity related to conflict in the Middle East, impact on shipping, obviously Russia, Ukraine. And so, to use the metaphor of the wildfires, we don't know where the wildfire is going to start, but we know the ground is dry. And in the case of, these kind of El Nino effects, that's literally and metaphorically true, because a lot of the countries that are in greatest danger of being affected by these are the countries that are least equipped to deal with it financially, economically, and therefore politically.
Right.
And, you get food insecurity, you get refugees. You get political unrest that crosses borders. That is definitely a story that we're highlighting for 2024.
How food secure is China?
China is dependent on imports for food as well as for energy. But this is an interesting, I think that there's a lot being done by China to try to make its own food production more efficient. And strides are happening, but more interestingly to me, when thinking about food security, global food security, and how that affects China, is the fact that the United States has long enjoyed much more significant soft power than China. There's Hollywood, there's Taylor Swift and Beyonce, and so much more. But when it comes to things like the spillover effects of the U.S. support for Ukraine standing up to Russia, and the fact that that is viewed by many countries in the global south as prolonging the conflict, and thereby prolonging their food insecurity. China has an opportunity to win hearts and minds, and I think is capitalizing on that in a pretty significant way.
By the way, I think this is a good opportunity to throw in a country that is very important, that's having elections this year that we have not mentioned, I don't think, and that's India. Because India has played some of that role that Anna's describing of being a bridge. The current Indian government, led by Narendra Modi, is very interested in improving its relationship with the United States in a way that is not traditional for India going back to its founding in 1948. There's always been a kind of deep reluctance to engage with Western powers, and Modi has kind of pushed that aside, in large part because of the rivalry with China. And one of the ways in which India has actually played a very constructive role in its chairing the G20 last year has been in trying to bridge exactly this gap that Anna's describing between the rich world and the developing world, to try and find more common ground instead of just playing one side off the other for a strategic gain. The Chinese would like to do this. The Indians may be better at it. One example, I was just on vacation in the Caribbean, actually, and I was on this little island, and I saw all these empty buildings, and that looked like construction had started and been abandoned. And I asked someone who knew, like, what's with the buildings? And they said, oh, this is another story where China came in and invested a lot of money in the infrastructure, but only wanted to use Chinese workers and really alienated everyone. And it's another example of where China would like to play this role of we invest everywhere, but maybe other countries are better at doing that. They read the room better than the Chinese do. And India is actively trying to cultivate that role for itself. That's a good news story for 2024, which we need.
Yeah, we need a little bit of good news here. Well, friends, this has been fantastic. This has been a tour de force around the globe. We even got to the geostrategic implications of Taylor Swift and Beyonce even just a little bit. So to bring it home, to conclude, maybe I'll ask you one sort of concluding fun question. Black swan events that you're thinking of that could invalidate large parts of what we've talked about today. What's on your risk register? One thing that could change the game from what we've talked about today.
Well, if China were to become much more aggressive with the Philippines, And, kinetic engagement happened, resulting in deaths on the Philippine side or even on the Chinese side that then escalated to more kinetic engagement. The U.S. would likely feel compelled to stand by its mutual defense treaty and come to the Philippines' defense. And that, could unfold into a serious conflict between the U.S. and China and definitely throw everything out of whack.
I mean, the nature of black swans makes them hard to talk about because they're supposed to be the things that no one saw coming. I mean, there's always the risk of terrorism can change the politics of big countries. I think that the slightly more foreseeable risk that is very unlikely to happen but could is, again, outside powers, both the U.S. and China, are working in their own ways to try to contain the two wars, to make sure that the war in Ukraine does not extend beyond Ukraine and involve NATO in a conflict that neither NATO or Russia really wants. Iran does not want to go to war with Israel. Iran wouldn't win a war with Israel. Hezbollah knows that. Hezbollah has an interest in being provocative up to a point and then stopping. And the Houthi rebels from Yemen who are firing on ships in the Red Sea, this is an issue that Iran thinks it can control. The same with some of these militias in Iraq and Syria. But what if we're wrong? Or what if they're wrong? What if an accident happens? Because the history of the world is a history of conflicts that nobody really wanted until they became inevitable, and then no one could figure out.
Often started by accidents.
How to get out of them. A guy gets shot on the street in Sarajevo, and suddenly we have World War I. Right. Now, again, we're talking black swan. These are not things that we expect to happen, but we should be watching very carefully to make sure that there isn't something that sort of breaks out of the pen because somebody didn't get the memo of don't push this beyond a certain point. And with two wars going on, it's a risk that everybody has to take seriously every day. We didn't even talk about North Korea.
No, we didn't. What's a black swan event that's positive? Can we call that a white swan?
Yeah.
So can we laugh/cry about the fact that in the midst of the balloon controversy in 2023, the China balloon controversy, when the U.S. was shooting down unidentified aerial vehicles all over the place with Sidewinder missiles. The Pentagon released all sorts of new information about the existence of unidentified aerial vehicles,
aliens.
Potentially the existence of aliens, and that did not, in fact, bring the world together. So we will not have a white swan event involving aliens. I think that's pretty good.
I'm so disappointed because I thought you were going to tell us that outsiders were going to solve all these problems that we've been talking about. And you're saying that's not going to happen, which unfortunately I agree with you.
Well, there is maybe hope.
To solve our own problems.
I guess we're going to the problems of humans have been created by humans, so they can be solved by humans, right?
Yeah, hopefully.
Thank you very much for all your time today. This was fantastic. Clearly, we need another podcast so we can talk about North Korea, the axis of rogues, and all the things we didn't get to. But thank you for your time, and I look forward to doing this again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
it's great
Scott.
to be here.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.